Welcome to part 2 of chapter 10, where we're going to be covering the effects of shocks in the real business cycle model. Now, last time we talked about real supply side shocks. We talked about labor supply shocks and technology shocks, or total factor productivity shocks. This time, we're going to be covering some demand side shocks. Now, I said there were going to be 3 demand side shocks. There are really only going to be 2. And these shocks are going to be coming from the demand side of the economy. They're going to be affecting mostly nominal variables. Thus, they're going to be propagating a little differently throughout the economy. So where supply side shocks were affecting a lot of real economic variables, like all of them, wages, labor, output, the real interest rate, here, a lot of these shocks really aren't going to be doing that. So let's move on to see why. The first shock we're going to talk about is an investment shock. Now, if you remember, the equation for investment in this model is given by equation 1 here, where that Q, really the only thing you haven't seen much, is a measure of how healthy the financial system is. Now, this is really going to, you think it's going to be a supply side shock. You're like, well, there's like capital and stuff like that. Yes, this is true. However, this is originating in the demand side of the economy. Why? Well, because it's coming from a household decision. If you remember the whole consumption savings problem, this is really sort of an extension of that, right? The household is going to be consuming a little bit less and saving a little bit more. So if we look at equation 1, right, there's an increase in investment. It's going to be increasing the flow of new capital, but it's not changing the existing stock of capital. So it adds to KT plus 1 and doesn't change KT. So output today is not changing at all. This increase in Q is going to make firms want to invest more given some real interest rate. So we're going to see an increase in households' desired expenditures, which shifts the expenditure line upward. So if you remember this when we were trying to derive the aggregate demand, right, we kind of moved this around a little bit. Well, this is exactly what we're going to see here. It shifts upward because investment goes from I0 up to I1. Now, I'm flying through this because you really don't need to know how to do this stuff. It's really the 4 graph system that I'm interested in for this part of the class. So that shift in the expenditure line is going to shift the IS curve out. And as that curve shifts out, right, remember this guy was on top of this guy, we get this increase. It's going to pull the IS curve out, thereby increasing the interest rate and hopefully increasing output, right? Our output would go from here over to like somewhere in the neighborhood of here. Now, let's move over to that 4 graph system to really see what's going on. With an investment shock, we have an outward shift in that IS curve, as we saw right here, which is going to imply a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So aggregate demand shifts outward. Now, if aggregate supply were like upward sloping in the direction this mouse is going, we'd get a little bit of a change in output here. However, we don't in this case because aggregate supply is vertical, right? Remember, it's independent of prices. So because it's independent of prices, a shift in aggregate demand doesn't change output, and prices are just going to pick up the entire shift of aggregate demand. So it's going to increase that price level from P0 up to P1, from the black over to the blue. So we can see an aggregate demand shock, at least originating in the expenditure function for the household, isn't going to be increasing output at all. It's only going to be changing prices, which is really kind of similar to the solo growth model. Because in the solo model, well, I mean, granted, there weren't any explicit prices. But it's the same idea as saying that there are prices, but there's no real effect. Here, monetary neutrality is a consequence, you can think of it as a solo model, or of the solo model. So as the RBC model is kind of based off of solo, we can sort of think of it as the solo model, just sort of an extension of it, right? So this is what we get in the 4 graph system. So what happens is that investment increases, and if it does, output's not going to be increasing with it. So what happens? Well, if we get this shift in aggregate demand, and investment is increasing, but output's not changing, when you look at that resource constraint, y equals c plus I, well, if I is increasing, y doesn't change, what has to happen? Well, c has to fall. Consumption has to fall. So there's a decrease in consumption by an amount equal to the amount that investment increased by. Now, let's talk about government spending. Everybody loves government spending, right? Except when you got to pay for it. So, in this event, government purchases some increased quantity of goods and services. Now, under the predictions of the model, as we've discussed about really in the first lecture of this particular model, an increase in government spending is going to reduce consumption and investment, and it's going to leave output unaffected. So, households and firms here both have rational expectations, and the economy exhibits Ricardian equivalence. So, because of that, with this aggregate resource constraint given in equation 2, if the government were to increase their purchases, households know this means that these purchases have to eventually be financed with tax revenue. So they reduce their consumption in order to pay for the government's new activities. So, the government's like, hey, we're going to send out $1,200 stimmies to everybody next time everybody gets sick. Hey, that sounds super cool, except at some point you're going to have to pay that back with higher tax revenue. Now, when the stimulus checks went out like 3 years ago and people were like, well, you're not going to be taxed on that, so don't worry about it. Okay, sure. But you're going to be paying for that at some point with higher taxes. Like if it's financed via deficit today, it's got to be paid back at some point, which means the government's going to have to tax more. So a little bit of a trick there, but whatever. So what happens is you see a reduction in consumption to cover for the government's new spending stuff. Now, the government spending shock will also alter the IS curve. Now, if you notice, it shows up twice in the IS curve. Once directly as an independent component of expenditures, and then once inside the consumption function. What's the consumption function? Well, it's this guy right here. So this is the desired expenditures function, right? The consumption function, we've got government spending showing up, boom, right there, Y minus G. Okay. Basically, this Y minus G is disposable income. It's income that you're getting minus what the government wants to spend, assuming that government spending is equal to taxes. So the increase in government spending has a positive direct effect and a negative indirect effect throughout the consumption function. So government spending is going to be increasing desired expenditures, but because aggregate supply is vertical, it's not changing output at all. So it's going to cause an increase in aggregate demand, but with a vertical aggregate supply curve, output won't be increasing and prices will be increasing. So if output can't increase with an increase in government spending, it implies that the other two components of GDP are going to have to decrease. So if you look at the consumption component of desired expenditures, if you look at G, right, G increases, that means that consumption is going to have to fall. Why? Well, because this is, well, what the hell is that? Whatever. Minus G. So if G goes up, it's having a negative effect on consumption. Okay, let's move on to investment here. The investment function, all right, is a function of the real interest rate, AT plus 1, Q, and K, and it's decreasing in the real interest rate. So if the IS curve shifts out, holding that LM curve constant, then interest rates are going to be increasing. And when interest rates rise, investment demand is going to fall. So investment as a component of GDP is also going to be falling. And with that shift in the IS curve, increasing interest rates, aggregate demand is going to shift out, which increases prices. So both consumption and investment will have to decrease if government spending increases in this particular model. So it means the government is like, hey, I want to use countercyclical fiscal policy. Let's say for some reason we go into a recession. The government wants to use countercyclical fiscal policy to try to stimulate demand and increase output. Well, they're going to be reducing consumption and they're going to be reducing investment, increasing prices, and they're not going to have any effect on output. So think of it as a fixed size of the pie. If you hold the size of the pie fixed and somebody goes, I want more pie, well, that means you have to give up pie to let them have more pie. Now, this right here would be why a lot of people don't think that the government's capable of spending the economy into prosperity. There are also other reasons why the government is incapable of such. I'm not really going to get into it right now. It gets a little theoretical at times. However, one of the many reasons why the government isn't necessarily capable of just spending us out of a recession. So, like I said, rather than increasing the size of the pie by spending more, government spending is just going to keep the size of the pie the same. They're going to take a bigger piece for themselves, and they're going to leave everybody else with less to enjoy. I know it's kind of a simplification, whatever. This is what's known as the crowding out effect, because the government spending is going to mean there are fewer resources available for the private sector, namely by increasing the real interest rate. So they're not basically you'll see some changes in real economic variables here, but not any of the good ones. It's going to be increasing the real interest rate, which then means that there are fewer resources for investment. Thus, investment is crowded out, and we see less or slower economic growth in the future. Now, the model does allow for other shocks to hit the economy as well. Now, the two that the model includes that I'm not covering right now are money supply and expected inflation shocks. Both of these shocks will have similar effects in that monetary neutrality holds, and the only variable that's impacted is the price level. So it means the monetary authority is also going to be incapable of stimulating the economy by expansionary monetary policy or some sort of like government intervention. Now, when we learn about monetary policy and we learn a little bit more about expected inflation, then we can come back and we can kind of look at this. But we're really going to be applying it more in the sense of the new Keynesian model because, well, that has more interesting economic effects. So just know that these shocks are out there. We will be talking about them, although in a slightly different context. So to kind of take stock of everything that we've learned with this model, it is sort of an update on the classical economic school of thought, right? It's very supply side oriented, and it suggests there's monetary neutrality, a vertical aggregate supply curve and prices. So basically, demand shocks won't be affecting output at all. So the question is, does it hold up to the data? Does it explain short-run shocks well, like at all? Well, the answer is yeah, kind of. But it does a really fantastic job of explaining the response of the economy to a productivity shock, especially in the medium to the long run. Now, the next table that we're going to look at is going to show the endogenous variable responses to shocks to the exogenous variables. So the column variables are the exogenous shocks. The row variables are going to be the endogenous variables. The sign in the zero entries in the table are going to show the direction of the response of the endogenous variable to the shock. So what do we have here? Well, this shock right here is increase in A. That is the good old supply side shock that we looked at. It's the technology shock right there. What do we have? Well, I have an increase in output, consumption, investment, labor, wages, reduction in the real interest rate, reduction in prices. All right, what about that labor supply shock? Well, that increased output, consumption, investment, labor, cut the real wage, cut the real interest rate, and prices. Let's look at investment. All right, so this is the first shock we learned about today. No change to output, as I had said. Consumption, well, that decreases because investment increases. No change to labor, no change to the wage rate. Prices increase, and the real interest rate ends up increasing. Okay. What about government spending? So government spending, no change to output. Consumption and investment both decrease. No change to wages or labor. And then we get an increase in the interest rate and prices. So we can tell a difference between these two shocks because of the change in investment here. So we can identify these two shocks uniquely. We can identify these two shocks uniquely. And then finally, the monetary policy or the money supply shock and the expected inflation shock, which we'll be covering a little bit later. All right, so how would we test something like this? Now, as I've said before, we use models to simulate data, and then we compare that data to the real world. Now, what we really care about are the covariances, or like the correlations between these variables. So if the simulated correlations match the real world correlations, then the model can explain stuff pretty well. Now, in the medium to long run, the economy really gets a chance to begin to react to major developments, and the real effects of changes in nominal variables start to diminish with time. So, a lot of the short run variations that we would really like to see aren't going to show up in the real business cycle model, just because the way it's set up it's not designed to show us what happens in the short to medium run. So really, it kind of makes you think, okay, maybe this isn't the best business cycle model that could exist. Or maybe it is good for business cycle stuff, but it's more like long run effects or medium run effects of business cycle stuff. Maybe it's not that good at showing us what happens in the short run. So, ultimately, a model is developed from this one that better explains short run variation. And that model allows for price stickiness, which then gives us an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And it's going to also tell us that markets aren't entirely efficient. So there are some equilibria where, the equilibrium is not an efficient equilibrium. It could be improved. So there are inefficiencies in the market, which then lead to the necessity of government and monetary intervention. The government and monetary authority can have some power to exert over the economy with fiscal and monetary policy. And this leads to something that's called the neoclassical synthesis. And the idea of the neoclassical synthesis is that the model we talk about next explains stuff in the short run really well, while models like the real business cycle model explain stuff in the medium run really well. So they're both useful. They're just useful in different contexts. Now, I'll let you look at the correlations here on your own, but what we're seeing is this correlation with output. How correlated are these guys with output? So I'll let you kind of look through that on your own. So when we look at the data, we can see that shocks to A and labor supply shocks generate the right signed responses to what's in the real world, but the correlations compared to the real world data are off by just a little bit. Now, an issue that we see is with a one-time increase in A, that total factor productivity, it's going to reduce the real interest rate while output increases. But if we look at real world data, the real interest rate doesn't vary with the business cycle quite as much. So something's a little off here. It's augmented, though, if we consider that an increase in technology is generally pretty persistent. Nobody's going to invent technology today and then have it suddenly disappear tomorrow. So there's going to be like a persistent increase in A through AT plus 1 and so on and so forth. If this happens, the increase in A is going to be decreasing the real interest rate, but the increase in the other AT plus 1 and so on will decrease it, increase it, showing there's little to no effect on the real interest rate overall. And when it's done this way, the model can actually generate co-movements that are a little bit more in line with what we see in the real world. Now, another issue with the RBC model is that it suggested unemployment only occurred because workers weren't being paid their reserve wage, which is kind of dumb to think about. Because it says firms are always willing to hire labor, and even if the economy is in a recession and it's experiencing unemployment, well, it's still an efficient outcome. And it's only experiencing unemployment because the reserve wage isn't high enough. So if you've ever heard the name Paul Krugman, my apologies, he was once a brilliant international trade economist. And then he won the Nobel Prize, and he thought he knew everything about economics. But anyways, economists like this guy, Paul Krugman, just went after the model because of that, saying it was, suggesting that, people affected by unemployment in a business cycle were just lazy or something like that. It's really dumb stuff. Whatever. Look, sometimes the models will make bizarre simplifying assumptions that, the intuition may not make a lot of sense, but the outcome of the model, the predictions generated by the model do make some sense. It's life. It happens sometimes. So ultimately, what's going on here, though, is it's assuming that there are problems in households that are generating unemployment, and there aren't problems in the firm. So the firm's like, hey, we're perfectly healthy and we're always willing to hire people regardless of what's going on. And if people don't work, well, it's because they're lazy or they're greedy and they don't want to work. It's kind of dumb. Whatever. Finally, economists also took issue with that total factor productivity thing. They argued a positive TFP shock made perfect sense because, new technology augments the efficiency of inputs, creating, increases in output, things like that. But they argued a negative TFP shock would be a little bit more difficult to justify because to them, it means that people are forgetting how to use technology, which you'd think isn't a very realistic assumption. However, as I've talked about before, there has been technology that has been forgotten over time. So it's not really the most unrealistic assumption that we could possibly be making here. And again, though, the model did generate data consistent with what we see in the real world, but the way in which it was to be interpreted within the model itself was maybe a little bit more of a hard sell. So overall, the real business cycle model is pretty good for medium run considerations. It's good at giving us answers to maybe like what the economy is going to be converging towards in response to different shocks. But for the short run stuff, we might need something else. So what are we going to do next? Well, we're going to learn about fiscal and monetary policy. Once we're done with that, we're going to move on to the new Keynesian model, where we're going to learn about short-run economic responses to shocks. And then we're going to really see how it improves on the RBC model. Because it improves on the RBC model, we can then extend it to look at other real-world events, things like the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and maybe if we have a little bit of time, we can also touch on the COVID-19 pandemic, because they're all pretty interesting. So with all that said, thank you for watching this video. This is going to wrap up Chapter 10, and we'll be moving on to Chapter 11 next. So keep an eye out, and thank you for watching.